And I must start with an apology, which is that there isn't really a legal case, a proper legal case being taken against Anglo-Irish Bank in Ireland. There's what I would describe as a minor, slow-moving legal case, but there is a kind of public education and advocacy campaign, and that's really what I want to talk about, and what the possibilities for the kind of legal action that's taking place in Spain and elsewhere, how we might be able to learn from and build on that. What is also happening in Ireland at the moment is that there is a comedy musical about this now dead, failed bank, which is running. I haven't actually seen it. It's not supposed to be very good, but it has the tagline: "All it takes is a few Muppets to screw an entire country." And it's done in a kind of puppet form. Now, one of the things I want to argue is that it was a much more systematic, a much more systemic and deep-rooted problem than that. And it has its roots in the, my apologies, there's quite a lot of data up here, but just to give you some flavour of the scale of the property price bubble in Ireland, I think quite similar to Spain in many ways, I think. A massive increase in house prices, a massive increase in borrowing, household debt rising almost threefold over a 5-year period, 2003 to 2008. The Irish banks who were lending to households and to property developers were borrowing that money from abroad. They were borrowing it from German, French, British, Belgian and other banks. And that left the Irish economy during the middle to end 2000s hugely dependent on the construction sector for employment, for taxation revenue, and so on. Now, whose responsibility was that? Well, it was a mixture. It was, I would argue, a co-responsibility between, on the one hand, the very lax regulation across the European Union, the liberalised lending practices across European borders, the fact that the European Central Bank cut its interest rate to accommodate the needs primarily of the German economy in the early 2000s, which obviously made it easier for Irish banks to recklessly borrow cheaply from abroad. But of course the Irish government and the Irish authorities were also deeply complicit. They instituted a number of tax incentives to property development, and they generally operated a very light touch regulatory system that, as we will see, gave carte blanche to the more reckless elements of the Irish banking system to engage in a frenzy of speculation. The Irish financial regulator famously said that his approach to regulation was that there's mutual trust between the regulator and the industry. Now, Anglo-Irish Bank, the bank that I'm mainly talking about here today, was the most spectacular lender during the Celtic Tiger boom period. Its loan book was growing very rapidly. It was very much a niche bank. It specialised in speculative property development, and as a later newspaper report noted, it would approve a deal in a day, whereas other banks might take weeks to do it. And they were also famous for doing deals on golf courses, as this quote from a property developer notes. If you want to borrow money from a bank during the summer, your best chance is to get a good hearing, or a soft hearing, is on the golf course. Its leader, from its chief executive from 1986 to 2005, is a man called Sean Fitzpatrick, who then became chairman until 2008 when he resigned. His practices were very much adopted. He, as I said, this was the most spectacular speculator, but the other banks very much followed suit. The rather confusingly named Allied Irish Bank, no relation to Anglo, which was a much longer established bank. For example, this is a newspaper report from earlier this week in an Irish newspaper. They're pursuing a case trying to get loans back from an alleged fraudster who in his testimony said, well, it wasn't my fault. They gave me 740 million euros without asking me any questions or checking my background. And this was not uncommon at the time. And it was generally lauded in the media. The media was full of stories of the lifestyles of property developers and bankers and so on. This is the man here. This is Sean Fitzpatrick. And this is a close associate of his, a man called Michael Fingleton, who was the leader of the Irish Nationwide Building Society, another very prominent property speculator, property speculation financier. Fitzpatrick's pronouncements were greeted with great acclaim during the boom period. This is a quote from him in 2005, arguing against control and regulation, because he said control and regulation would squeeze the life out of our economy. What we need is intuition, imagination, a spirit of adventure. Very classic kind of neoliberal doctrine. Remarkably, he maintained those views in October 2008, after his bank had been rescued by the state. I'll say more about that in a moment. He called for the economic crisis to be responded to by a cut in the already very low rate of corporation profits tax, by cuts in benefits to children, and by cuts in medical benefits for old age pensioners. So he, even after the crash, very clearly saw where he thought the pain should be borne, not by him. A very good book, for those of you, I don't think it's been translated, but it's a book by an Irish journalist, Simon Carswell, documents in the aftermath of the crash of this bank some of its activities. There's 2 slides drawn from the author of that book. This shows you the huge growth in Anglo-Irish's loan book over a very short period of time, very spectacular rise. And this shows you the growth in its profits over a very similar time period. Again, phenomenal growth in declared profits. Now, it's slightly misleading. It was actually, in the later period, it was hiding a lot of losses. But nonetheless, in terms of what it was publishing in its annual reports, this shows you the speed with which it was accelerating. There were a number, that massive growth was underpinned by a number of very dubious business practices. Fitzpatrick himself, the chief executive and chairman, was borrowing money from the bank, sometimes borrowing it to buy shares in the bank himself. And when the auditors came at the end of September each year, he temporarily moved those loans out of the bank so that the shareholders would not find out that the chief executive and chairman was actually borrowing large sums of money from his own bank. He moved the loans temporarily for about a week into the Irish Nationwide Building Society, the one run by his friend and crony Michael Fingleton. Right. Okay. Okay, right. I thought I had a little more time. Okay. There were political links that we haven't been able to prove between the National Treasury Management Agency, sorry, not the National Treasury, but which was the state agency, the Debt Management Agency. It was asked in 2007 to put more money on deposit with Anglo. It bravely refused to do so and earned the anger of the then Prime Minister as a result. There is a very egregious symbol of kind of political business links in Ireland called the Dublin Docklands Development Authority, which is engaged in a number of very spectacular investment plans in a particular region of Dublin. Anglo-Irish Bank was lending the money to undertake those activities, even as 2 directors of Anglo-Irish Bank, including Sean Fitzpatrick, were sitting on the board of the Dublin Docklands Development Authority, not only lending the money for these schemes, but also charging fees for the administration of these schemes. Some criminal charges, I mentioned that there isn't much happening legally, some criminal charges are being made, specifically out of an incident in July 2008, just before it all blew up, when Anglo allegedly gave loans to individuals to buy shares in the bank to maintain their price, though actually, and I think it's an important point, there's strong evidence that that was actually approved by the Irish financial regulator and the Irish Central Bank at the time. Nonetheless, 3 senior executives, including Fitzpatrick, have been charged with those offences under investigations which were commenced in February 2000. Oh, I do have a little more time. Okay. Okay, is that okay? That's okay. Yeah, I don't need that much, but okay. Oh, I just couldn't understand how I'd gotten through so much time so quickly. Okay, 3 senior executives, including Fitzpatrick, have been charged with those offences. They're released on bail. Those investigations, however, took 3.5 years before they got to the stage of charging anybody. And in January of this year, a judge told one of the criminal units involved in the investigation that he was shocked, he was taken aback by how slowly this investigation was proceeding and by how few resources were being put into it. Now I think what that speaks to are the very close links with the state that the actors involved had, and it isn't really in anybody's interest to, for a lot of those to come out in the open. So you've got this long-running saga. Now, having said that, one person is currently in jail. I'm pleased to announce to start. His name is Sean Quinn. He comes from the part of Ireland where I come from. He made his fortune in construction and insurance, a major entrepreneur and employer, and he was involved in the deal that I just mentioned about. He was one of the people who was lent money to buy shares. He had invested enormously in Anglo shares and was very exposed. He had done so through, earlier we were hearing about credit default swaps. He had done so through a mechanism called contracts for difference. He was basically putting down about 20% of the value of the shares he was buying, and then he was, as a kind of a deposit. It was a way of building up a very substantial stake in the bank of dubious, transparency or clarity. The shell of Anglo-Irish Bank, which is now, it's now been merged, Irish Nationwide Building Society and Anglo have now been merged into an entity called the Irish Bank Resolution Corporation. That corporation is pursuing Quinn and members of his family and others for debts that they owe Anglo-Irish, or the old Anglo-Irish. And in that capacity, the Quinn family has been involved in moving assets out of the reach of the Irish Bank Resolution Corporation, and it is for that offence that Quinn is currently serving a 9-week term. His son had previously served a short sentence also. So, very, very limited action. And again, I'm sorry, this is a hopelessly overloaded PowerPoint, and I can send these on. If anybody wants to read these in more detail, I can send them on. I'm happy to just give you my email. This is about the contracts for difference, the means by which Quinn was building up his highly exposed share in Anglo-Irish Bank. The Department of the revenue collectors, the taxation people in the Irish government, tried to put a tax on those contracts for difference in 2006. A key government official responded to lobbying from the financial sector and succeeded in getting that proposed tax scrapped. He was subsequently promoted to the head of the Irish Department of Finance, and last year he was nominated by the new Irish government, not the old one, he was nominated by the new Irish government to become the Irish government's representative at the European Court of Auditors. So he's now your problem, not just ours anymore. But what I'm trying to make here is that the very close links between decision-making, state decision-making, and private banks. Am I doing for time? 5, okay, great. Now, I think obviously those actions, what has happened, needs to be pursued with the full vigour of the law. But there is, in many ways, in the view of many of us who are campaigning on this issue, there is actually a more serious crime now being perpetrated, which is the way in which the debts of Anglo-Irish and Irish Nationwide are being dealt with. When they essentially, their debts, as with all the other Irish financial institutions, in September 2008, the Irish government guaranteed all their debts and said, if you can't pay your debts back to the aforementioned German, French, British banks, we'll pick up the bill. And that has been happening ever since. For the last 5 years, we have been picking up the bill. In the case of Anglo and Irish Nationwide, they had no money to repay the bonds, as bondholders, when the bondholders come in. The Irish Central Bank gave them the money, so-called emergency liquidity assistance to do so, and the Irish state issued as collateral for that support so-called promissory notes, IOUs, equivalent to about almost 31 billion euros. And what that money is being used for is to repay the people who lent money to Anglo and to Irish Nationwide Building Society. For example, in January this year, 1,250 million was paid by the shell of Anglo to bondholders, anonymous bondholders. We have no idea who they are. This accounts for a very substantial chunk of Irish debt, almost 17% of total Irish government debt last year. And the way in which the logistics of it work is that every 31st of March, €3.06 billion is signed over by the Irish government to the shell of Anglo and Irish Nationwide, Irish Bank Resolution Corporation, and then they give it back to the Irish Central Bank. What did the Irish Central Bank do with it? They burn it. They literally take it out of circulation. And because this seems such a particularly egregious and outrageous action, this is what our campaign has tried to focus upon, these promissory notes. We're not saying the rest of the debt is legitimate by any means, but we are focusing in on this particular tranche of the debt. This is the old Anglo logo, so we've adopted that as part of our campaign. And it's a wide-ranging network of people under the umbrella Debt Justice Action. These are the member organisations, global justice organisations, community groups who are at the forefront of the cutbacks, a trade union, quite a few religious organisations, and 2 academic departments. So it's quite an interesting and varied coalition of campaigners. So I'm moving towards a conclusion. Be done in 2 minutes. Obviously, yes, Anglo-Irish is and was a cowboy outfit, and its leaders should face much more vigorous prosecution. But the links between the political and business elites in Ireland mean that such vigorous prosecution runs up against very significant hurdles. For example, we changed government at the beginning of last year, but the man who is now the Minister for the Environment himself received 2 very favourable loans personally, directly from Michael Fingal, the head of Irish Nationwide Building Society, one to allow him to buy a house in the most luxurious part of Dublin, and the other to allow him to buy a luxury penthouse in Portugal. In the final case, to say that there was minimal paperwork is an exaggeration. There was no paperwork. He got this loan directly from the head of the Irish Nationwide Building Society. So you have to ask the question, if this is one of the most senior ministers in the current government, and he is, how seriously is he going to want to investigate the scandals that occurred during this era? I think it's quite likely that some individuals, including Sean Quinn, to some extent, perhaps even Sean Fitzpatrick himself, might be made partial scapegoats, while other senior figures, the heads of the other banks, who aped and copied his practices, and government officials like Kevin Cardiff, are walking away scot-free, or in many cases are actually being rewarded with for example, with very lucrative pension payments. But at the same time, while I think we do need to find ways of trying to hold those people accountable, in our view, the most serious harm now being done to Irish society is not now to benefit corrupt bankers, but rather to obey the diktats largely of the European Central Bank vis-à-vis the promissory notes. And I think what that reflects is not so much the crony capitalist nature of Irish society, though God knows it is that too, but rather the Irish elite's very deferential and dependent relationship with the European Union and other external actors. So, thanks.